She stood quietly in the customs line, passport in hand, dressed in a navy blazer with an American flag pin, unnoticed, like she always had been. That is, until a voice cut through the air. "Ma'am, step aside. We need to question you." No explanation. No courtesy. Just suspicion. People stared. A few whispered. Someone muttered, "She doesn't look like she's from here." Her heartbeat pounded, not out of fear, but from something deeper. A memory. A lifetime of being othered in her own country. What the agents didn't know was, this wasn't just any woman. And when she reached into her purse, she wasn't pulling out documents. She was about to pull rank.
If you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a moment that matters.
It was supposed to be a quiet return home. Senator Layla Amin had just wrapped a human rights summit overseas, a trip that left her exhausted but hopeful. Her mind was still on the testimonies she'd heard, stories of exile, persecution, and identity theft. But nothing prepared her for what was about to happen to her. The moment her boots touched American soil, something felt off. She noticed the stares. The hushed voices behind desks. The way one officer nudged the other when she approached the customs booth. Layla wasn't in formal attire. Just jeans, sneakers, and a hoodie, nothing that screamed power. No entourage. No camera crew. Just a woman returning home. When she handed over her U.S. passport, the agent's brow furrowed. He scanned her name, looked her up and down, then stiffened. "We're going to need you to come with us." She blinked. "Is there an issue?" "No questions. Just follow us." Her heart sank, not out of fear for herself, but for what this meant. For every name she'd fought for on the Senate floor. For every citizen who didn't have her platform. As she followed them through a side corridor, far from the public eye, a sick familiarity returned. This was the same walk her father took decades ago when he was detained at an airport for random checks. Back then, she was a teenager, helpless, watching him get humiliated. Now she was a U.S. senator. And yet, none of that seemed to matter, not to them. They didn't recognize her. Or worse, they didn't care. Inside the holding room, Layla sat across from 3 officers, 2 DHS agents and 1 TSA supervisor. The walls were bare, the lighting harsh, the air thick with suspicion. "We need to verify your identity," one of them said, not offering his name. They didn't ask where she was coming from. They didn't offer water. They just stared, waiting for her to trip up. Layla, composed but simmering inside, calmly asked, "Am I being detained?" "You're under secondary review," the agent replied. "Standard procedure for high-risk profiles." She paused. High risk? Based on what? The agent looked at his clipboard. Travel patterns. Origin country. Unmatched ID flags. She leaned forward slightly, voice steady but tight. "I've traveled on diplomatic clearance before." "What flag?" He shifted uncomfortably. "It's just protocol, ma'am." Layla didn't need to guess, she knew the game. She had read countless case files like this. The system didn't just have cracks, it had patterns. And she had become one. Still, the room grew colder. One of the agents even muttered under his breath, "Can't ever be too careful these days." Layla felt a wave of old pain rise in her chest. Not for herself, but for the countless brown, black, immigrant Americans treated like strangers in their own home. For the kids who cried as their parents were held. For her father, whose voice had trembled when he told her, "Don't ever let them treat you small." And here she was. Being made small. They asked her to surrender her phone. She refused, and that's when the threats began. "If you don't cooperate, we can escalate this." She took a deep breath. She had tried to give them grace. But now, her patience had run out. She slowly reached into her jacket pocket. 3 officers leaned in, one even unfastened his holster. And then, with one swift, deliberate motion, Layla pulled out her wallet and slid a worn, leather-bound ID across the table. The seal of the United States Senate gleamed under the fluorescent light. The room fell silent. The agent who had just threatened to escalate things blinked at the ID in disbelief. Senator Layla Hassan, he read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. The other 2 agents stood frozen, scanning the badge, the signature, the seal, all authentic. Layla's voice finally broke the silence, steady and sharp. I sit on the Senate Homeland Security Committee. I've read your playbook. And I know exactly how many of these so-called secondary reviews disproportionately target people who look like me. She stood up slowly, her eyes locked on theirs. You didn't ask me a single question about my travel. You didn't offer a lawyer. You just saw a hijab, and a last name. The lead agent opened his mouth, fumbling for words, but nothing came out. Do you know how many times I've spoken on national television about civil liberties? About bias in airport screenings? She stepped closer. And today, you just gave me a fresh example to bring back to Congress. The supervisor looked mortified. Senator, please, we didn't know. Layla cut him off. That's the problem. You never know. You just assume. A long pause. Then she leaned in and whispered the final blow. The flight you delayed was waiting for me to speak at a federal hearing on anti-discrimination. Their faces went pale. Layla picked up her ID, tucked it into her coat, and walked toward the door. I'll be filing a formal report. And next time you see a brown woman in line at the airport, maybe ask her name before you assume her threat level. She walked out, head high, leaving them speechless. Outside the terminal, a gust of wind swept through the airport flags, but Layla stood still. She didn't cry. Not here. Not now. But inside, her heart ached. Not just for herself, but for every woman, every immigrant, every child of color who didn't have a senator's ID to protect them. She made her flight. Hours later, she stood at the podium in Washington, facing cameras, congressmen, and citizens across America. This morning, she began, I was detained at the airport. Not because I broke a law. But because I look like someone who might. Gasps echoed through the room. I am a U.S. Senator. But before that, I was a daughter of immigrants. I've seen what discrimination does to a person, how it chips away at your dignity. And it's still happening, in places as routine as security checkpoints. She held up the boarding pass they almost tore up. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that still treats some Americans as suspects, before it treats them as citizens. The room stood silent. Then, applause. A week later, new legislation was introduced to increase oversight on TSA profiling practices. It was